And now we go to our third panelist, Jodie Yuzhou from Fudan University, talking about transnational networks of African and Chinese. Welcome, Jodie.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie, for the kind introduction, and Roberto for the invitation and organization of the conference. It was a pity that we did not have a virtual conference in Hong Kong last year, but as a remedy for that pity, I think it's a great opportunity to see a lot of the members of the CAC network here in the virtual mini conference. I think my screen has been shared and it's clear for everyone to see. So basically, today I'm going to introduce a new project after completion of my review, which is going to explore the exchanges of people and ideas between decolonizing African countries and the People's Republic of China during the Cold War. The research will try to examine a range of Africans' experiences, including but not limited to politicians of initiating, deepening, or negotiating relations with China at a time of global ideological contest. Through a close reading of national archives, English and Chinese newspapers, and other possible in-depth interviews, the project would illustrate how transnational networks infused with a real and imagined shared colonial past, competing ideologies, and the developmental state contributed to and shaped the distinctive trajectories of China-Africa relations. So basically, I'm going to look at three main levels. The first level is on the structural side, is trying to understand and explain how networks have functioned as sites of both connections and ruptures in the global south. And secondly is about conceptual level. We try to understand and explore the significance of race, gender, and religion in shaping the mutual conceptions among Africans and Chinese. And finally, individual level is also quite important, is to understand the questions of agency and contingency, interactions between historical context and individuals. So these are really, really general points. And I have to meet that the kind of a case study I'm going to examine is really at a developmental stage. And I would like to particularly thank my two co-authors for their paper, who are Yuan Mingqing and Zhang Lifang. So I'm going to talk about the particular role of the transnational networks of Afro-Asian writers. So here are some of the kind of major conferences of the Afro-Asian era in the 1950s and 60s. And of course, the Bandung Conference of 1955 is often described as the beginning of what Vijay Prashad called the Third World Project. While it was undeniable that intergovernmental gatherings as such had largely facilitated political connections between Chinese and African leaders, no less significant in cultivating a heightened Bandung spirit in the decolonizing world were the transnational networks, such as the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Conference, Writers' Conference, Women's Conference, and Journalists Association Conference. So these platforms allowed a privileged group of writers to travel in North and West Africa. Feng Zhidan, Du Xuan, and Han Beiping were among them. Their travel notes later published as the examples here, Glimpses into West Africa Diary, and Nights in Africa, carefully described local landscapes, climate, architecture, as well as their personal encounters with a range of Africans outside the state apparatus. Likewise, a Malian minister and writer, Mamadou Gologo, recounted his tours in China and deep appreciation for the country. La Chine, un peuple géant, un grand destin. China, a great people, a great destiny, was published in both French and English by New World Press in Beijing in 1965. And these writings opened up the limited space of understanding those less formal Sino-African interactions outside the confined places. Existing research about Afro-Asian literary movements tend to concentrate largely on the meetings and publications organized by the Afro-Asian Writers Bureau, which was abbreviated as AAWB. Due to its communist leadership and later competition with the Soviet Union, China's role in these Afro-Asian solidarity movements has been discredited by many observers as self-serving. While in no means trying to overturn the claim that Beijing carried out its own ideological pursuits in its participation, the paper pays particular attention to other crossings on less formal occasions and by less known figures. So here I show a fantastic visualized a program of these, some of the Afro-Asian networks, which you can explore later. But in the case of Gologo, which was the particular figure that I'm examining here, he stopped in Jakarta for the second conference of the Secretariat of the Afro-Asian Journalists Association before he arrived in Hong Kong, then entered mainland China. Arrived with him was a Japanese president of the Journalists Association, again proving that this invitation was facilitated through the Afro-Asian networks rather than bilateral diplomatic services. His travels in China lasted about 1 month and covered places other than the capital or government buildings. Of course, all of those visits were carefully planned in advance, but it does not mean that his account of events and people were fabricated. The challenge here, of course, is to analyze and assess the degree of fictionality in those texts as historical archives. Compared to Africans who travel in communist China, those reverse trips undertaken by Chinese writers and journalists in Africa were less tightly controlled by local governments. They enjoyed a rare exposure of local cultures and people in African countries for the purpose of studying the history, culture, and people of the Third World. Their writings produced during and after the journeys were called reportage, which according to Loughlin demonstrates a consciousness that is not primarily individual, but cultural and collective. By using travelogues and reportages as two interchangeable genres, Loughlin nevertheless underestimated the heterogeneity of these writings, both in styles, contents, and narrative structures, other than the shared ideological inclination. In addition, the issue of intertextuality between Chinese and African travel writings needs to be properly addressed in order to understand their political and imaginative sensibilities in the process of decolonization. So next I will go to the particular figure of Gologo with a short biography. A Malian government minister, physician and writer, Gologo occupies a unique yet little known position in the rich history of Sino-African cultural exchanges. Having received training in medicine, he initially worked for a number of military and civil administrations in West Africa until he was involved in the Union Soudanaise, a branch of the French West African political organ, Rassemblement Démocratique Africain, RDA, created in 1946. Gologo's political capacity was demonstrated in his various roles in the colonial administration, including the Ministry of Public Health and the Information Service in the 1950s. By 1961, after the Republic of Mali gained political independence on the 22nd September 1960, and the USRDA became the nation's sole political party under President Modibo Keïta, Gologo was named Secretary of State for Information and Tourism, Director of the national USRDA newspaper, La Serre, and President of the National Union of Journalists in Mali. Gologo's intellectual pursuits, political service, and creative endeavors thrived in journalism and literature, although he was not trained in either discipline. His first collection of poetry, Mon cœur est un volcan, My Heart is a Volcano, was released in Moscow in 1961, followed 2 years later by his first novel, Le Rescapé de l'Asilo, The Survival of Aeschylus, which was published in Paris by Présence Africaine. Written in the style of prose and poetry, both works were intended to disseminate his political ideologies and philosophical perspectives to local and international readers. His writings also appeared in Afro-Asian Journalists, a monthly magazine produced by the Afro-Asian Journalists Association, with the aim to create a unified information domain for the entire world, for the entire third world, sorry. It was through this particular channel that Gologo's life trajectory crossed with that of Chinese writers. Without doubt, Gologo's visit to China was nothing coincidental. He held senior position in Keita's government, and most importantly, he was the theoretician of the ruling party in its official adoption of socialism since 1962. Here, an important distinction has to be made between Marxist class-based analytic approaches to socialism and state-led African socialist experiments, both of which, however, fall under the broad umbrella of socialism in Africa. The case of Mali belonged to the latter. Together with Kwame Nkrumah and Sékou Touré, Modibo Keita was an outspoken Pan-Africanist. His belief in the true worth of Africa is expressed through a conception of a universal civilization. We believe willingly and in all good faith in universal civilization. For us Africans, it represents the sum total of the contributions of all civilizations. We do not consider it the prerogative of a single continent, even less of a single country or a single group of countries. A similar comment can be found in Gologo's book. He said, "China is more than a country, she is a continent. I have said this before and I shall say it again. I do not say this to make people afraid of China. Far from it. I say it primarily so that no one need fear a people of this caliber and power who work as well with a wooden abacus as with electronic computers of their own making." Gologo clearly perceived China's capacity and achievements as something influential beyond its territorial boundaries, though it might not necessarily serve the interests of its Asian neighbors and the West. History and culture are invaluable assets in China-Africa relations. Above all, Mali's pre-colonial past was valorized at the service of modern nation building in the aftermath of independence. A lineal descendant of Sundiana Keita, a legendary emperor of the 13th century, Modibo Keita was equally dedicated to restore the glorious empires of the Mali culture of early centuries. Political virtues such as unity of the people, thanks to the existence of a single party, happiness of each through the work of all, and vice versa, and the single objective, economic independence, laid the essential foundation of the Republic of Mali. At the same time, similar virtues were advocated by other African leaders, such as Kenneth Kaunda and Julius Nyerere, but Mali stood out for Keita's strongly pragmatic view of history. Ongoing anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggles were depicted as continuations of local resistance during early colonial rule. Such a linear understanding of human history was also commonplace in the Chinese travel writings about Africa in the 1960s, but with their foremost emphasis on the class division. To Han Beiping, Egyptian pyramids represented the loss of royal power, whose construction had much human cost in the first place. How did ancient Egyptian civilization end, and why was modern Egypt destroyed? Han asked. Not intended to address the first question, he believed that his readers, presumably Chinese, would give immediate answer to the second question. Again, European imperialism and colonialism were to be blamed. In Feng Zhidan's glimpses into West Africa, the connection between Africa and imperial China dated back to as early as the 10th century and developed even closer in the 19th century as a result of their shared miseries. Often termed the century of humiliation, the political infiltration, economic exploitation, and military invasion by Western imperialists is said to have destroyed China's splendid civilization and created a historical memory of enormous humiliation, which still resonates powerfully today. And Mali's lost kingdoms, or even empires in this case, in the view of the Chinese, were simply victims of European imperialism. And that's all for my talk. Thank you very much.